very good afternoon and welcome to the program. My name is Josephine Karunji. The conversation that we're about to delve into is done with support from Akinamama Africa, supported by Urgent Action Fund Africa. We'll be talking about illicit financial flows plaguing the outflow of resources for gender justice. And this subject is carefully chosen to increase demands for accountability to stop the loss of resources critical for achieving development outcomes, particularly gender justice. But before we start our discussion, I would like to invite Eunice Musime, the Executive Director of Akinamama Africa, to open this e-conference and also speak briefly on the organization and its economic justice work and interest in macroeconomic policy issues, particularly illicit financial flows. Eunice?
My name is Eunice Musime. I'm the Executive Director of Akinamama Africa. Akinamama Africa is a Pan-African feminist organization that focuses on advancing women's rights in Africa. We do this through research and knowledge building, feminist leadership development, and policy influence and movement building. This particular conversation that we are having this afternoon is focusing on illicit financial flows, and it falls under one of our thematic areas, which is economic justice. One of the reasons why Akinamama focuses on economic justice is that we recognize that macroeconomic policies are not gender neutral. The choices that governments are making and other actors in terms of macroeconomic policies affect men and women, girls and boys differently. So Akinamama, as a feminist organization, we hold these conversations so that we are able to pull out the gendered impacts of some of the choices that our governments make and other actors, and bring them to light, be able to debate them, and ensure that the impact that on women and girls is highlighted in order to inform policy development, implementation, practices, methodologies, etc. We are so excited to be having this conversation today. While globally the issue of illicit financial flows has gained momentum, we felt that in Uganda, this is a conversation that we need to ensure that is being debated more than currently being debated. And also we felt that there was need to create further awareness on the issue. We are glad that, for example, we are being joined by Honorable Irene Ovonji, who is going to share the global perspective. But then we also have Andrew, who is going to be bringing on board the Ugandan aspects of this. And then we'll have a perspective from the regulatory authority, the Financial Intelligence Authority. And we'll also have my colleague Leah, who will be speaking specifically to the gendered aspects of illicit financial flows. For many of us, in 2015, when the Mbeki panel released the report on illicit financial flows, it was a watershed moment. For some of us, it was with a lot of surprise to discover that Africa is losing over $50 billion in outflows, in illegal ways, which is less than the aid that we receive as Africans. And for many of us, naively felt this was an issue where African governments and civil society could be able to sit on the table and advance and say, Africa does not need aid anymore. We need to be able to retain the resources that are generated internally for our own development. Of course, there's been lots of progress, and we'll be hearing from the panel in terms of what progress has been achieved, but also this has been quite an uphill task, because we also recognize that there are other systems at play that interface and intersect with an issue like illicit financial flows that then impedes its progress, and therefore all those interests that are visible and invisible need to be brought to the fore. And I'm glad that we are having this conversation this afternoon to be able to debate some of these issues. And of course, the ultimate goal is to see how these flows to see how these monies, to see how these resources are able to be used for our own development. So we cannot speak about African solutions for African problems without ensuring that actually the resources we are using are ours, and we can be able to direct how those resources are being used. So this is an opportune moment for us to see how Africans, Ugandans, and pro-democracy groups, pro-development groups can be able to tap into this issue and ensure that we find sustainable solutions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Eunice. You've really just done my work for me. So I'll quickly introduce my panel, the panel that you have spoken of, that will be joining in this conversation. And I'll start with Andrew Chambade at the end there in a red tie. Andrew Chambade is a tax consultant and lecturer international taxation at the East African School of Taxation. Andrew, it's a pleasure to have you.
It's a pleasure being here.
Next to Andrew is Leah Erenyu, who is Research Advocacy and Movement Building Manager at Akinamama Africa. Leah, it's good to see you.
Thanks for having me, Josephine.
Right, and next to me is Sydney Asubo, the Executive Director, Financial Intelligence Authority. Welcome, Sydney.
Yeah, thank you, Josephine, and I'm happy to be here and happy that you have me here.
All right, and joining us online is Honorable Irene Ovonju Odida, who is a lawyer and member of the UN High-Level Panel on Financial Accountability, Transparency and Integrity. Honorable, it's good to see you.
Nice to see you. No, nice to meet you today.
All right. Well, let's get into our conversation and pivoting to today's topic, illicit financial flows. Leah, I will pose the first question to you so you can set the stage. Could you break down the topic? What do you mean by illicit financial flows? How do they manifest? Who are the main players here? Who facilitates these illicit flows?
So my partner says the very first time he saw the acronym IFF, he thought it stood for International Feminist Federation because of the space in which I work, which obviously is not the case. So when we're talking about illicit financial flows, we are simply talking about the movement from one country to another of money, of capital that is illegally earned, illegally used, and illegally transferred. So those are the key words: use, earning, and transfer. So when we're talking about illegal transfer of money, we could be talking about cash smuggling, we could be talking about money laundering. When we're talking about proceeds from an illegal activity, we can be talking about money from a drug sale, or if we're talking about money that is used to finance an activity, we can talk about money that is used to finance an illegal activity. Rather, we can talk about money that's being used to finance acts of terrorism. Yeah. So when we're talking about illicit financial flows, we look at three broad categories. We look at proceeds from corrupt activities. We look at proceeds from commercial tax abuse, and then we also look at proceeds from criminal activities. Of course, when I talk about corrupt dealings, to the average Ugandan, that is something that's quite familiar. It can range from giving 5,000 shillings to the to the traffic officer to not give you a fine, or it can go higher up to someone looking to set up a business and bribing a government official in order to win a tender. When we're looking at proceeds from criminal activities, they can also go back to issues that I talked about, such as drug trafficking. We can look at things like poaching, which, you know, if you follow news at the airport, there's usually a lot of stopping of export of tusks and pangolin scales. But in order for these criminal activities to become legitimate, it's important that that money is also cleaned. And this is what happens in a process called money laundering. And then the very last activity is through commercial tax abuse. When we look at the contribution of each of these three categories, the most amount of money that is lost is actually through commercial tax activities. About 65% of the money that is lost is through commercial tax activities. I must emphasize, though, that because of the nature and the secrecy of all these activities, it's very difficult to find out how much money is actually lost. Eunice earlier talked about $50 billion being lost annually on the continent, but we're actually not sure about the exact scale. So a lot of the money that is lost from commercial tax activities is through tax evasion and tax avoidance. Yeah. And when we're talking about tax evasion, it can be something like cooking your books. So you have two sets of accounts. There is one that you present to URA, and then there is one that has the actual activities. And then you can have tax avoidance, which is what Trump has been doing. So the news came out over the weekend that Trump paid only $750 in taxes for an entire year. And he didn't do anything illegal, actually. What he basically did was apply things that are in the tax code in the US to facilitate him and prevent him from paying the taxes that were actually required. And so this is where the distinction between illicit and illegal comes in, and it's quite important. Yes. So when we're talking about illicit financial flows, we are saying that they come from illegal activities, but there are actually certain legal activities that contribute to it. But we call them illicit because they're simply immoral, they're unethical. It means that you are benefiting greatly from this community, but you're not paying your fair share. So it's the same thing as a multinational corporation coming here and getting a tax write-off, but I still have to pay my pay-as-you-earn. I don't have the resources to be able to do aggressive tax planning. And so I want to finish off this part by going back to the different percentages that contribute to illicit financial flows. So Africa has a bad rap as an inherently corrupt continent, and a lot of the citizens have developed this kind of apathy that is really how we are. But that's a narrative that we actually need to challenge. When you see how much money we are losing as a continent, most of it doesn't come from corruption. Most of it comes from commercial tax abuse. And who are these people that are abusing our tax laws? Most of them are multinational corporations. And all this money is leaving the continent and going to power these cities. It's going to Luxembourg, it's going to London, it's going to New York. And, we're left with a tab to pay. So I hope that this conversation can be the first step in us challenging that narrative and pushing back against what actually looks like the reconquest of the continent.
Leah, you've practically ticked all of the responses, the questions that I gave you, but what you haven't answered is who facilitates, and you've answered who is doing it, but who facilitates these illicit flows?
So obviously the global financial architecture, the way that it is set up is what facilitates the flow of these resources. But I would like that Andrew and Honorable Vonji, who are actually experts in this field, I think they're better placed to answer this particular question.
All right. Andrew?
Yes, thank you much, Josephine and Leah. Globally, when you look at the setup of the whole economy or the whole international scope, there are particular boundaries for every country. But now with the development and globalization, the economy has become one. It technically means that trade flows all over the globe without any control. So the structure of the global world now it's borderless, boundaryless, and therefore it is facilitating the flow and quick flow of businesses and trade, which in the effect leads to such illicit financial flows. Yes.
All right. Yeah. I don't know if Honorable Ovunji wants to add to that.
Thank you very much. It's just very quickly to the issue of illicit flows themselves, and then also about the enablers. Just to emphasize that when we're looking at illicit financial flows, it is a subset of a broader category that is illicit finance. And illicit finance is about national and cross-border financing of illicit activities or transfer of resources or use of resources illicitly, as Leah has explained. So illicit financial flows, or IFFs, which is the acronym that's used, is the subcategory of illicit finance that crosses borders. So the critical bit about it is that it crosses borders, and as she has explained, we're looking at money earned illicitly, or money transferred illicitly, or money ultimately used illicitly. And those are definitions that have been developed by people, organizations like Global Financial Integrity that are focused on it, but are also being used by organizations like the World Bank and the Mbeki panel, which I was a member of, uses the same definition that Global Financial Integrity has developed over its more than 20 years of work on this issue. However, as Leah has said, what I also would stress is that there are different definitions. Some people use a narrower definition of illicit financial flows. Some countries prefer to use that mostly countries in the advanced economies, which focus on illegal actions or activities and transactions. But for Africa and for developing countries, the preference has been to look at the illicitness as including activities that are not always illegal but are unethical. Broader, because that encompasses the whole range of activities that impact on their economies. The other thing that I could mention, you questioned about who are the enablers, and what we found with the Mbeki panel, which we did the work on the Mbeki panel between 2012 and 2015, after being commissioned by the AU Council of Finance Ministers, and the report that we prepared was presented to the AU summit and adopted by the Summit of Heads of State and Government. The chair of that process was His Excellency Thabo Mbeki, the former president of South Africa. So this was taken as a very high level of priority by the AU, just by the nature of the process that was set up, and also by the chair of that panel. So who are the enablers that we found in the process of going around? We went to a number of African countries, meeting various actors from the private sector to the civil society to the heads of state and relevant cabinet officials. And so what we found as we consulted around Africa and also looked at other reports was that the nature of transactions that drive illicit financial flows are largely commercial. So as has already been mentioned, mainly commercial, that accounted for about 2/3 of IFFs from Africa. And considering that IFFs from Africa were to the tune of $50 to $60 billion per annum, and which in the past 50 years up to 2015 was totaling over $1 trillion, that's quite a huge amount. You think 2/3 of that. And the criminal element was 30%. The criminal activities such as trafficking, drug trafficking, human trafficking, and other forms of trafficking, poaching, smuggling, and so on. That accounted for 30%. And then the bribery element, which is relating to bribery of government officials, accounted for about 5% from Africa. So the enablers, and these are people and institutions found at different levels, sometimes at national level, but also pretty much at global level, are people who we referred to as intermediaries. And those intermediaries were largely the institutions and the professions that play a role in facilitating the transfer of illicit funds, the removal of these illicit funds from the countries where the wealth or the profits had been made. They included groups like lawyers, say corporate lawyers, in-house lawyers, bankers, accountants, auditors, financial tax experts. So the kind of people who would advise corporations, they would be part of banks, would advise them on how to best structure themselves legally in order to take advantage of certain rules existing that would then help them to get money out from where the profits were made. Recently, we heard about the FinCEN leaks that came out in the last week or so. That highlighted the role of banks and the way in which money laundering, commercial activities, including tax evasion and tax avoidance, were being facilitated by banks, by the banking industry, and not just small banks, but the largest banks globally. So the banking industry, in spite of rules that require them to show due diligence, to ensure due diligence in the banking transactions, and to ensure that they do not receive quote unquote dirty money. Yeah. So the enablers are people who quite often in society and at a global level are seen as quite respectable, so respectable professions. Lastly, what I also would add before on the question of enablers is that they take advantage of gaps in legislation. It may be tax codes, it may be rules, international rules relating to trade, relating to accounting. So take, for example, transfer pricing, abuse of the rules relating to transfer pricing. That is, it's often done by corporations, particularly multinational corporations. So they take advantage of loopholes in rules in countries. They take advantage of misalignment between the rules of different countries. So if you're operating as a corporation in Uganda and another country, and the two rules do not quite align, and there's a gap that's created because of a mismatch between the rules, say, of Uganda and another country where you're also operating as a corporation, they may take advantage of that. Yeah. And they also will take advantage of gap of rules in other countries that allow activities that enable you to transfer resources from where you are making a profit into those other countries, such as rules, say, on banking secrecy, or rules relating to taxation, and rules relating to accounting.
All right. Thank you very much, Honorable, for that elaborate information. Sydney, I will turn to you. We know that illicit financial activities are, widespread globally. We know about corporations which are headquartered in tax havens in order to avoid their tax obligations in the countries where they operate. Which government agencies are responsible for curbing illicit financial flows?
Thank you. Now, I will start with briefly touching on the issue of
tax havens.
Tax havens before I come to the issue of who is responsible for curbing this. Now, the taxation, or how a tax is administered in a country, is a sovereign right. So countries that are defined as tax havens are those whose tax rates, especially for corporation tax, are very, very low, either 0 or 1 or 2% for corporation, especially for corporation tax. That's broadly speaking the definition of a tax haven. Now, why they have been castigated globally is that companies, especially multinational companies, tend to arrange their tax affairs in such a way that they are then taxed in these kinds of jurisdictions, so that the country where the monies are generated and everything else are then left with pretty much little else to tax on. Now, so that is the broadly. Now, in terms of who is responsible, of course, it's again a very broad category.
Before you get to who is responsible, I know there was a question earlier on whether we are acknowledging and saying tax havens are okay.
Well, you see, the broad issue of tax justice globally is one. It's easy to take a view on either side, because, and the view I hold personally is that the condemnation has been unduly unfair to the tax havens, because, like I've already said, this is a sovereign right. Now, if a country feels aggrieved by the way the tax havens are behaving, so what is the solution? The solution is that instead of condemning the tax practices of the other jurisdiction, then you should instead look inwards. So instead of looking at affairs in, it's like the problems, I shouldn't, the problems in one jurisdiction, or the way affairs are run in one jurisdiction, much as I am not happy with them, because they're taking away what I feel is due to me, then the incumbent actions are on the jurisdiction. to make their tax policies in favor of the investment climate in that particular country. And then one also cannot conclude this topic without looking at the other benefits that accrue, because in majority of the countries, especially in our part of the world, the issue has come up with, especially with the countries that we have double tax agreements with. Now, in my view, when you have tax agreements with countries that are defined as tax havens, or they have lower tax rates than you, then you as a country are definitely going to suffer in terms of the way the multinational arrange their affairs. But then one has to look at the other arm of the argument, that while the tax havens will deal mostly with the components of the corporation tax, the other benefits that will accrue to the investments these countries bring in. So those have to be netted off. You net off the losses in courts accruing from the non-payment of tax in this particular jurisdiction. You net it off with the benefits that accrue from having this investment in the jurisdiction. So the employment and then the infrastructure and other things that come with it. So when you net that off, then what will you then categorize as the net loss to that country? In my view, that is how the conversation should be defined.
Well, let's proceed with who is Leah, unless you want to say something.
Respond briefly. First of all, I find it very surprising that the executive director of the Financial Intelligence Authority, that is in charge of stemming or getting rid of money laundering, has any form of sympathy or understanding with the way tax havens are structured. Taxation is a political issue, and taxation is a function of power. It's a show of power. So I think to then say that if you like it, if you don't like it, fix it. If you don't like that tax havens have more palatable or more attractive tax codes that force multinational corporations to keep their money there, then simply change yours. It is not as easy as that. The entire financial global architecture is like a spider web. Our tax systems are not necessarily independent, and they don't work in a vacuum. We have to realize that we are working in a global system. So we have tax policies that are recommended and they're written by much wealthier countries. We have the World Bank actually putting out an ease of doing business report, where basically countries are being encouraged to deregulate and make it easy for multinational corporations to come and do business. So a country like Uganda with a small, with a small economy such as ours, we are the kinds of people that are actually going to roll over and take the World Bank's advice. It's going to be so much more difficult for us to then just say, okay, we're not going to do this with the Netherlands. And I think the Netherlands is one of the countries where we have a double taxation agreement. So it is a much more complex discussion than a small country such as ours, flexing their muscles and saying, no, we are not going to do this. We actually, if we look at the Total case, I don't know how long it's taken for us to actually negotiate. I attended a meeting one time where the commissioner, the commissioner at the time of the URA, talked about the lack of solidarity among African states, because if this country doesn't want to do it, there is going to be another one that's going to accept. So I remember at the time Tanzania was saying, Uganda, why are you not constructing the pipeline? And Uganda was saying, well, the terms are still not good for us. So as long as you have an enabling environment, which tax havens actually provide, then it means that this practice will not stop.
Well, Sydney, before you respond to Leah, Andrew, do you want to say something so that Sydney takes it all in at once?
Yes, thank you very much, Josephine. Maybe to give this discussion context, we need to appreciate that taxation is a creature of a law. It's a creature of a statute. And every country, once we obtain independence, we have the right to do the things the way we want to do them. Now, in Uganda, and I'll be specific, in our constitution, we have a provision that says there's not going to be anything called taxation unless it is based on an act of parliament. Now, we have the different laws that have been set up. You have the Income Tax Act, the VAT Act, and all those laws. Now, we need to keep in mind that as Uganda, we are not simply closed. we operate with a global economy. Now, within the legislation that we make, we must put in provisions that enable us operate with the international community. And I'll be specific. In the Income Tax Act, for example, you have the international aspects of Uganda's tax principles or the tax law. So the law is basically predominantly domestic, but then there are those international aspects that now come up and play or blend with the global community. Now, what we need to do as a country particularly is focus on our law. If we feel that there's a disadvantage with the tax haven or with any other particular country, then the onus is on us to flex. How then do we match them? How do we ensure that we do not erode our tax base? If there are good policies internationally, how do we work within our legal framework to ensure that we jump on them and then take advantage? I'll give an example. We have the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. It has come up with some very good policies. Currently, there was, in 2012, the Base Erosion and Profit Shifting Project. It has very good and wonderful action points. So if Uganda wants to tap into that, come back to your legislation, make amendments, and then be able to take advantage. That's what I want to contribute. Thank you.
Sydney?
Yes, I agree entirely with the submission made by Andre. I think that's the same point that I wanted to make, but I didn't make it as well as he has done. But because the issue is that indeed you fix what is wrong with your own system before before you talk of the speck in somebody else's, look at the log in yours. Now, if you look at most of these tax havens, they actually, contrary to what they say, they're not actually very big states. These are small. They tend to be small island states, mostly in the Caribbean. Of course, they are the bigger big economies. Yes, but so it's not that I am overly sympathetic to them, but I do understand why they structure their affairs the way they do, because for majority of them, other than tourism, the only other thing that goes for them is their tax administration. So why condemn them for the way they structure? Because that's how they want to develop their own economy. So you can't, as long as they're not breaking any law, and they are not. And that's why the issue of what constitutes illicit, what constitutes an illicit flow comes into play. Like
Sydney, I know this one can go on and on because I see Leah preparing her gloves to take you on. Could you just speak to us? I think we'll continue that particular conversation,
okay,
but speak to us about the government agencies responsible for curbing illicit financial flows.
Of course, there will be the very agencies that are responsible for fighting financial crime generally. So you have the law enforcement agencies, because the reason why in our context is very important is that when we did the national risk assessment, the money laundering, terrorism financing risk assessment 3 years ago, one of the surprising findings was that one of the findings we made, which was quite surprising to many of us, was that many of the proceeds that are obtained through crime actually don't flow out of the country. They're invested within, or they remain within the economy. So that means that to be able to get, so these flows, the money is generated here, but there are no outflows. Although there are limited outflows, but what was disturbing was the reasons. The reasons being that many of the people who obtained these illicit funds felt no compelling reason to take it out, because they felt the systems were weak to catch them. Or if where they're caught, then they'll be able to beat the system. That was the sad part of it. So to answer your question directly, yes. So the law enforcement agencies and the regulatory agencies like ours, and of course those in charge of the policies, those in charge of tax administration, to make to put in place the policies that will discourage the outflows, especially depending on the main category, the commercial practices, because that is where the biggest portion of the illicit outflows comes from. Then you have the tax. Of course, you can't leave the URA out, because they're responsible for enforcing the tax laws. Those will be the ones responsible.
All right. Thank you very much, Sydney. Honorable Ovonji? Honorable Ovonji, yes.
Yes, please.
Were you trying to say something, or should I pose my question to you?
Yes, I did want to say, to comment on the discussion around tax havens and international rules and regimes and how they impact on countries. And I'll try to be a little bit quick. I think the issue is, while it is true that taxation is a sovereign right, issues to do with tax and issues to do with trade and investment are not solely controlled at national level, because the illicit financial flows touches on tax, it touches on trade, it touches on investment, and it also touches on international relations. So curbing or ending illicit financial flows is a responsibility that has to be dealt with at multiple levels. Countries have a role that they must play at a national level to deal with their local laws and their loopholes. However, because IFFs take advantage, the perpetrators of illicit financial flows take advantage of international rules and regimes, and also take advantage of loopholes created between the differences between different countries. They take advantage of the asymmetry or the differences in rules of different countries, and take advantage of international rules, as I mentioned earlier, on rules to do with accounting, auditing, banking practices, for example. So they take advantage of all of that. That means that while countries have a responsibility to take action at national level, the solutions cannot only be at national level. And this was one of the key findings of the Mbeki process, as well as the process that I'm involved on now, on the facti panel, that there has to be international cooperation as well as regional cooperation to boost and to supplement the actions that necessarily must happen at a national level. The other challenge around leaving it purely to a national solution in relation to the question of tax havens specifically, is that the net result of that is that countries begin to compete with each other to try and change their local regimes on investment and tax and so on to compete with another country. So you'll find that one country may have very low taxes or corporate taxes. Another country trying to attract investment will also start reducing. And so we have a phenomenon that's happened in many developing countries, including in Africa, of tax competition, and which has also now spilled over to the more advanced economies. There are studies that have found that in the past 15, 20 years, tax competition within Europe itself has also increased, and corporations are now beginning to paying lower effective tax rates than other citizens. So you begin to get that competition between countries, which in the end impacts negatively on everybody. So the solutions cannot only be at national level. Absolutely, there must be national commitment to create solutions at that level. But because of the cross-border dimension of illicit financial flows, they also have to be regional solutions. In the case of Africa, at the level of the AU, or at the sub-regional level, say within East African Community. And you also need some global solutions around this, because some of the rules that enable this are international rules. For example, the rules around transfer pricing are international, and those are taken advantage of by corporations. And lastly, on the issue of base erosion and profit shifting, that is one good example where transfer pricing rules are taken advantage of by corporations. So essentially what happens is you have a corporation which is operating in several jurisdictions, several countries, and it is able to shift the profits that it makes in one country on the books. So on paper, it will reflect that the profits it made in a particular country, which has higher corporate tax, was made in another country, because the international rules do not require them to break down their accounts by country to show how much they made, say, in Uganda, from the operations in Uganda, and separate that from the operations, say, in Kenya or South Africa or Netherlands and so on. And so, and they may have trade between the different subsidiaries of that company. So a company that has a subsidiary in Uganda and is headquartered, say, in the UK or in the Netherlands, will have trade between its Ugandan company, subsidiary, and its headquarter company, say in the Netherlands. In the course of doing that trade, which is referred to as intra-trade, quite often you find the books are also cooked. So this company, which has the subsidiary in Uganda, may buy pens from its headquarters in the Netherlands, and each pen is priced at, say, $100. So by doing that sort of thing, it's able to shift the profit it's making from Uganda out into the Netherlands. It's not necessarily illegal, but it actually is removing the profits that it's making in Uganda and reducing its base for taxation in Uganda. So Uganda then loses. This happens to many developing countries. The solution to that will not just be for Uganda to reduce its corporate tax, because then you get the tax competition where the corporations therefore are not paying a fair amount of tax based on the activities and profit that they're making in a country. So the solution cannot be only by Uganda. The solution has to come from international cooperation, from changing in those rules to require companies in multinational companies to demonstrate, to show in their accounts where they made profit, and to have the profits accurately reflected based on activities that they have in different countries. That takes international cooperation. So yes, countries need to do something, but there are some actions that can only happen through international cooperation at a continental level or at an international level. And lastly, that there is also pressure. So sometimes you'll find countries, smaller economies, will try to create rules to deal with these kind of challenges, but there will be pressure on those countries. That's why I would say illicit financial flows also deals with the issue of international relations is also a factor, and it is political in that sense. So these are some of the things that we found in the Becky process. And really the issue of tax havens, there is a misperception, and maybe I'll speak to that after the question. There is a misperception that tax havens are just these small island economies, you know, the Bermuda, the Bahamas, the Cayman Islands, and so on. Actually, experts on this issue have found and have written to show that the larger tax havens are in the advanced economies. So you will have countries within the EU, countries within the OECD, that play a major role through the kind of laws that they have on taxation, on banking secrecy, and so on, as havens for illicit financial flows, as havens for tax. So it's not just the small economies, the larger ones as well are playing a bigger, in fact, playing an even bigger role in this. So it's a whole network, and that's why the solutions cannot only be at national level, but require international cooperation.
All right, Honorable Ovunji, while we still have you there, do you want to explain how the global financial system enables the flow of dirty money? And you'd started to speak on it, so if you could speak a bit more broadly on it before I engage the panelists on this side.
Just speaking on that issue, and I already have talked to some of it. Yeah. In the Becky report and in the document, in the new process that I'm participating in, that was set up by the UN. This new process, I just want to speak to that a little bit. It is called, there's a panel that was set up by the President of the General Assembly and the President of ECOSOC earlier this year. The panel is called facti, which stands for Financial Accountability, Transparency, and Integrity. And the idea behind it was to look at the international financial systems and international financial architecture, the rules around international finance, to propose ways in which those rules could be changed and how the loopholes within them could be closed. So within the facti process, what we agreed on, and just to respond to your question, was that these rules fall into about 3 core areas. There may be others, but the main areas that we zeroed on were around taxation. So looking at issues relating to international taxation, whether you're looking at double taxation agreements, or you're looking at things, at rules relating to corporate tax, and that's where the base erosion and profit shifting, the example that I gave, and transfer pricing rules comes in. So it may be rules that deal with how companies are taxed, and how companies can carry out their trade, and how the profits they make from that trade therefore should be taxed. So one of the areas was around taxation. And a key thing within the taxation area relates to the allocation of taxing rights between countries. So there are rules, including transfer pricing rules and others, that shape the kind of rights countries have to tax economic activities that take place within their boundaries. Those rules were created more than 100 years ago by the advanced economies. At the time, quite obviously, most developing countries were still colonized and they were not part of the discussions that were done. What has been found over time by developing countries is that those rules are not fair. They do not fairly allocate taxing rights between advanced economies and developing country economies, so the low income countries. One area, and why they're not fair is because these countries have very different economies and economic situations. One example I can give is that most companies, most multinational companies, are headquartered in the advanced economies. So you'll find that their head office is based in a country in the global north, whether it's the US or country in the EU and so on. Most of them are in those countries. And as emerging countries, markets have come up, more and more companies, some are also now headquartered in those emerging markets like China and so on. But most were in the global north. And so when you're looking at issues to do with in trade and investment, the flows of investment are from the global north into developing countries. On the part of developing countries, you find that we have very large natural resource endowments. We have our land, we have our minerals and other extractives and so on, we have our populations. So our countries, for the most part, are capital importing. So FDI, foreign direct investment, comes from the advanced economies, for the most part, into our countries. And so our needs, our priorities within the international rules are not the same. For developing countries, the focus, and this is not just a recent thing, from 60s and 70s, developing countries have been pushing to have stronger recognition in international rules about the right of host countries, so countries that host foreign direct investment, that there should be stronger rules to protect them and ensure that these investments that come in can be regulated by those countries, to ensure that if the companies if the companies come into the country and impact on the environment, maybe harm the labor through labor practices and so on, the countries which are hosts to FDI under international rules can have a remedy. And so those kind of different priorities are some of the subject of discussion within different forums, including the BEPS process that has been referred to under the OECD. But the focus for developing countries, even within that BEPS process, has been to say the current rules are not fair, do not take into account our context, and they need to be changed so that they allocate taxing rights fairly between advanced economies and developing economies. So within the facti process, we said international tax and cooperation around tax to ensure fair rules that relate to the differences are important. Some of the rules also relate to how the companies themselves can operate. I've already made a reference to that. There's something referred to as the common reporting standards of the OECD, of the EU, which relate to how corporate accounting should be done. So we're looking at some of those things, so around to ensure that there should be country by country reporting, so that companies report their profits based on every single place they operate, and they break it down. So every country can see, in this country, from these activities, this is the profits that they made. And therefore, under our tax code, this is what they should be paying in taxation before they have removed the profits through the practices I talked about earlier. There's also something to do with automatic exchange of information. So ensuring that tax authorities are able to have information about taxpayers and their tax-paying practices in different countries where they are. This largely, again, affects corporates and also high net worth, wealthy individuals who may have income or wealth in different countries. So ensuring that the rules, the international rules, allow tax authorities everywhere to receive that information so that they can know this taxpayer who is operating in this country is actually posting something different in another country about their wealth to what they're reporting in our country, and therefore we know that there is a discrepancy and we can tax that discrepancy well. And the last element to do with tax, which would then ensure there's more transparency, is something that is referred to as beneficial ownership. So to ensure that, because remember, a company is a legal person. So when a company is operating in Uganda, it doesn't necessarily mean that you know who is the person who owns that company, who actually benefits from the profits of that company, who are the shareholders, is not necessarily clear. So the other element around taxation and transparency in taxation is something that's being referred to as beneficial ownership, that there needs to be some sort of a register at national level, but also increasingly there's a call for a global asset, for a global register that shows who the actual owners of these legal vehicles are and what assets do they actually hold, and that register needs to be publicly accessible. So one can see, kind of similar to what we have in Uganda for political for leaders. You know, under the leadership code, there's that requirement that all leaders of a certain category fill in a form, a declaration every year that says these are the assets that I have and so on. Right. So something like that is also being talked about in the tax area. Right. So that is global taxation, and then there are others I won't go into detail relating to corruption and the measures to do with that, and then issues to do with dispute settlement. Those are the issues around the international financial architecture that we're looking at. They include things like banking. They include issues to do with the rules relating to audit, accounting, and financial transactions, and how those the rules, international rules, need to require transparency of information.
All right, thank you very much, Honorable Ovonji. And I'll come to you. You want to say something, Sydney?
Yes.
Yes, very briefly.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond very quickly to what Honorable Ovonji did say about the beneficial ownership. Just to provide the Ugandan context. For the benefit of our viewers, until 2017, we had a problem with our legal definition of a beneficial owner. It didn't meet the international standards. The definition, it was defined in a way that even a company that owns another will qualify to be a beneficial owner, and yet that's not what the international requirement is. So we are put under pressure from the global standard setters. So we changed it. We changed the definition. So the current definition actually meets the international standards. It goes to the ultimate individual, to whom, if, for example, dividends were declared, who would be the individual in whose pocket the dividends will go. So that definition has now been cured. But that's not all. In our case, we have been asked to go an extra mile to make sure that by the beginning of 2022, Uganda has in place a beneficial ownership register. So, so the FIA, the Financial Intelligence Authority, together with the other stakeholders like the Uganda Registration Services Bureau, is working. We're working very hard to make sure that by January of 2022, Uganda has a beneficial ownership register in place. So it's one of the pressure points that is being applied on Uganda, and I'm very confident that by that time we will have this in place, and that will go a long way to address some of the issues that we're grappling with.
All right, thank you for that clarity, Sydney. Andre, I wanted to ask you a question, and then we can take a break. So what are the loopholes that we have here in Uganda which allow a corporation to get away with illicit financial flows?
Okay, thank you. And for our dear viewers, when you look at the legal framework or the regulatory framework, identifying a loophole requires a critical analysis of different provisions, the way they stand. And if we are looking at the multinational corporations, for example, let's begin from the point when they are registered in Uganda, and that is basically the Companies Act. if you are registering a company in Uganda, for example, I can be able to register for you a company without ever going to the URSP or to the registry. It means that the registry or the registrar will never be able to know that particular person who is going to benefit from that particular country. And that's a problem. Because then, whereas the beneficial owner has been ably defined, the company's law, for example, currently does not allow an interview or a verification of that beneficial owner. The second example I can also give you is scenarios where you have requirements of opening up of what they call opening a the corporate veil. That in the event that there are any suspicious activities by a company, the current position in Uganda is, in the company's law, for example, is it is the High Court that can go an extra mile to open the corporate veil. So it means, for example, even if Sydney has been able to identify something, he has to make an application to the High Court. And then it's the High Court that has to make that particular opening of the corporate veil. And that is particularly a loophole, because then the persons who do the day-to-day transactions and interface with these companies and the company owners should have the mandate or should have the power to go behind all the persons who are claiming or who are enjoying the benefits from the illicit financial flows. I'll also give you another example, and this is going to come from the tax perspective, the tax law. When you look at the structure of the tax law, the international aspects of the tax law were made in such a liberal way. And this comes from the background of Uganda as a developing or an underdeveloped country. That you make you structure it in a way that you want to encourage foreign direct investment. So in that process, you have to find a win-win. The investor says, I'm bringing capital into your country, so I want benefit 1, 2, 3. And also Uganda is also saying, but I also want revenue, but at the same time, I also want that investment to come into my country. So you find the laws that have been made, especially in regard to the exemptions, that are really weak, and there are loopholes that are being exploited or explored by these investors, and in the process, they facilitate such illicit financial flows currently in Uganda. So the problem is the way the legal framework is, and Sid and the team or whoever is concerned, they need to ensure that the laws are triggered or the laws are tightened in a way that all such opportunities, both the company law, from the commercial perspective, at least I'll speak for the company law, and the taxation law, they're able to cap such loopholes in the current tax system.
Okay. Oh, thank you, Andrew. Leah, do you want to say something before I take us for a break?
Yes, I just wanted to ask Andrew if there are any examples from the extractive sector, because that is also one of the sectors where IFFs are prone. For example, Uganda, I think gold is one of our #1 or #2 exports, and yet, you know, we actually know that there are really no big gold reserves. So maybe you can...
Just about the extractive sector, you see predominantly, or by its nature, it's an opaque sector. And you will see all studies globally. The extractive sector and the players are normally not known. You find so many anonymous shell companies actually operating in the extractive sector. But still, this comes back to the problem with registration, that you do not get to know who is actually the person. You find one person actually holding over 4 mining licenses, but through different companies, but you cannot know, you see. And that is actually a problem. By the nature of it, you have so many artisan miners, for example, at the different places, and these are not registered. These are informal in a way. Yes, I'm aware government is taking some steps to try to curb those problems, but also the extractive sector. And I'm happy currently, I think around April 2020, the government of Uganda applied and was approved to join the extractive initiative. And that's a very good move, because at that point, the key thing, if you have an opaque system or a system that is not transparent, then illicit financial flows is going to be a problem. So by joining such a platform, then information is going to be flowing freely and you're going to have the transparency. So these loopholes will be
there was quite a bit of shock when Uganda actually joined, because it felt like we were setting ourselves up to actually be held accountable. Sydney, do you want to, before we take a break, speak to the opaque nature of our systems? As Andrew has pointed out, they are. You're in the Financial Intelligence Authority. Why do we have systems with such glaring gaps?
Well, in terms of the regulatory framework, again, I'll look at it twofold. If you look at the strict definition of the illicit flows, dealing particularly with the illegal, what is illegal, I will say that the regulatory framework is up to scratch. It meets it's up to scratch and it meets the international standards. We have all the laws in place to cover that. The challenge I've always had, as we have said many times, is the implementation. But the opaqueness that Andrew is talking about is in many sectors, but particularly in extractives, because and that's one of the reasons why it is attractive, the opaque nature. Now, in our case here, it is worsened by the lack of an appropriate regulatory framework. So, other than for example, the licensing that is done by Ministry of Energy and Mineral Development, nothing else is done, because you get an annual license for the dealers. So pretty much nothing else is done in terms of providing oversight to these entities. So that makes it attractive to the money launderers and the other perpetrators of criminal enterprises. But additionally, the other challenge we will have in our context is the challenge with the verification of the beneficial ownership. So the information that has been presented to URSB at the time of account opening, and also banks are required to know their customers, the KYC. So when it comes to the banks knowing their customers, invariably they will rely on the information provided to URSB. So the articles and memorandum of association is what the banks will limit themselves to, because that's what is available to them domestically. Now, when it comes to the other companies, the international companies, typically what happens is that if a company is incorporated elsewhere, pretty much all they have to do is to file those incorporation documents, and then they'll be registered. Once they're registered, they're free to operate, including operating bank accounts. So those are some of the gaps that make it possible, because once you have an account, then a bank account especially, then it becomes easier for you to run your affairs, including then it comes to the other component of the illicit, the immoral and illicit component, which is the commercial activities structuring. Because again, I'll go back to the national risk assessment, because when we did the study, all the crimes that came top on the list of the crimes that generate the proceeds that then are later laundered have this opaque. One is, of course, trafficking in gold and other minerals, especially diamond, from the neighboring countries and as far as the West and Southern Africa. Then you have things like dealing in timber, and also things in timber, and then so these are ordinarily to be legitimate products, but then the players there, they have criminal enterprise, as opposed to those that are outrightly illegal. For example, dealing in wildlife products, and dealing in drug trafficking, and dealing in human trafficking. So that is the unique thing about those two categories of crimes that generate the proceeds that are then later laundered.
All right, I'm going to call for a break now, and then we can pick up with the discussion when we get back. Welcome back. Thank you for staying with us. We're speaking about financial illicit flows, and we have in the studio Andrew, Leah, and Sydney, and of course we have Honorable Ovunji on the other side joining us online. And I think I'll start the second half of our conversation, first of all, by reminding anybody who's watching that there's a conversation happening online, and the hashtag is Stop the Bleeding, so you can join in there. But Honorable Ovunji, I don't know if you can hear me. Yes. There you are. I wanted to start with a question for you. If you could share, you've been speaking about the Mbeki report, so if you could share findings from the report on IFF's facti panel report and the Finchin files, what is the implication of these leaks?
Right, thank you very much. Just as I mentioned earlier, the Mbeki process was set up by the AU, Council of Finance Ministers, in 2012, and we did research, we consulted in a number of African countries, Liberia, DRC, South Africa itself, Nigeria, Mauritius, a whole range of countries in Algeria and so on, just to kind of get different perspectives to the issue from Africa. And so these countries were selected because of the various elements within their economy that could show different dimensions. For example, DRC, because it has a large extractive sector, well, that was why we had that. Liberia, because it was a post-conflict country, and so on. So there were a number of recommendations that we made, and the major findings, one of them has already been mentioned, about illicit financial flows are large, and the figure, that the ballpark figure we had at that point was between 50 to 60 billion US dollars per annum. And over the 50 years leading up to 2015, when the report came out, over $1 trillion had been lost by African economies collectively. And the trend showed that the amounts every year were increasing. So if it was 50 to 60 in 2015, now it would be higher than that. So that was quite alarming. We also found, as I'm sure many viewers are feeling after listening to this conversation today, that illicit flows are highly technical. They're highly technical, highly complex schemes that involve commercial actors or criminal networks, and that often set up multi-layered structures in many jurisdictions to hide ownership and profits. So they're very complex, and for the ordinary person, even a professional person, it's very hard to understand them. And that's why many countries therefore need to build up the technical expertise, among regulatory bodies, such as the FIU, the companies registration bodies, the banking regulatory bodies, like the central bank, judiciary, the police, the customs officials. All of these need capacities built to understand, because it's a relatively new issue, and a crime that falls within IFF may not actually be captured as such in the law. So there's a need for investment. We also found it is highly political. From the discussion that we've just had, it is quite evident. And the politics of it is because of the kind of power groups involved in it, that engage in it, the kind of wealth that they generate, and therefore the influence that they can buy, including political influence. And this wealth is not just by this power, and this politics is not just at the level of the individuals and corporations that are involved in this kind of practice, but even at the level of countries. So relations between countries are also impacted by the wealth and the vested interests around illicit financial flows. And it was very clear that they undermine development. They have an impact on things, say in terms of economic development. They drain hard currency reserves. They cancel out the benefits from investment, including FDI. They heighten inflation. You might have heard, and the viewers might have heard of cases in Asia, for example, years ago, when there was destabilization of the Asian economies, when a lot of resources were just taken out from Asia, and overnight countries started experiencing huge economic challenges and high inflation. They also undermine trade, and they reduce tax collection. And if you remember, the purpose of tax the intended purpose of tax is to create public resources for states, so that those resources can be used for development. Think about COVID right now and the impact that COVID has had. For the past maybe 30 years, there's been this fallacy that development can be driven by private sector, and you can have and you don't need a role for governments. The COVID pandemic has just shown that that's not the case. There's a role that there's a role that governments have to play as kind of the central players in regulating other actors in development. Now, illicit flows reduce the public financing available, because they impact on the tax base for government, so that they cannot meet certain needs, demands in investments in health, in public health systems, investments in agriculture, and so on. And because of that, it means that things like the SDGs, which are international commitments all countries have made, cannot be met. In fact, it's said that there's a gap of about 2.5 to 3 trillion per annum that is needed to meet the SDGs for developing countries. And that gap, if you look at where the money is going at a global level, it's not that the money is not there. The money is there, but the money is being taken away and being hidden by corporations. So some global estimates around these flows is at 500 to 600 billion a year is lost from profit shifting. This is from the facti report that just came out last week. Lost from profit shifting by multinational enterprises. 7 trillion of dollars of private wealth is hidden in haven countries. 10% of world's GDP may be held in offshore financial assets. So this shows that the resources are there. It's just that the resources are removed and hidden. So the Mbeki report was adopted by the AU unanimously, and out of that they formed a AU Special Declaration on illicit financial flows from Africa, which basically is the position of African governments now on illicit financial flows, and a commitment by African governments that they will take action to follow up. One point I just wanted two quick points I wanted to speak to: the issue of international standards. I think it's a positive thing, that, as Sydney has mentioned, that the steps are being taken to ensure that in Uganda we have beneficial ownership addressed, that you'll have laws that will make it possible to know who are the beneficial owners of companies and to meet the international standards around that. And I think that is progress. What I would add to that, and this is from the findings of the current process of the facti panel, is that there are also gaps in the international standards. So countries need to take steps to meet those standards, but at the same time, the international standards themselves need review, and that's part of the process of what we're doing to plug gaps in them. So on beneficial ownership, for example, one of the issues with the current international standards is that the beneficial ownership registries are not necessarily required to be public. That makes it very difficult to deal with the issue of enforcement that Sydney has talked about. If you have public access to those registries, then the public can support the regulatory bodies, because the regulatory bodies don't have sufficient reach to check into every owner that is in that registry. But the public often will have information, or whistleblowers will have information that they can then share, and it helps the regulatory bodies. So that's one of the weaknesses in international standards. The other, and there are several. Another one that's been mentioned is that in a number of there are thresholds often in the beneficial ownership requirements. So, for example, in some countries you'll have, and many of these are European countries, they will have laws that will say if your share of that company is at least 25%, then you are required to be registered as a beneficial owner of that company. So what happens, what often happens in such cases is, instead of somebody having 25%, they will have 24.99%, and so they are not. So you can still have a substantial share of the company, but because of that threshold, all you do is have slightly less than the threshold, and you're no longer covered by that requirement. So those are some of the gaps in the international rules, and which is why we need international cooperation to ensure that those standards are actually fit for purpose.
Yeah, thank you very much, Honorable Ovonji. 24.999%. Right, when I listen to Honorable Ovonji and I listen to all of you and the things that you're saying, the implications of these leaks, the $50 billion for Africa and so on, why are we not having these conversations more? Why are these conversations that remain in your domain? But don't answer that. My next question is to you, Andrew. Some may argue that illicit financial flows is a risk whenever one invites multinational corporations to operate within their borders. Multinational corporations often provide jobs and skills to the local population, and it is through them that countries like Uganda can plug into the international markets. Are there successful examples of policies that minimize illicit financial flows while also attracting multinational corporations? Policies that Uganda can emulate?
Thank you very much. Yes, they are, and actually they have been very successful, especially from the angle of the tax law. Questions of tax law come from the Ministry of Finance, which sets the fiscal policy and then runs down into the tax collector or the tax administrator, which is the URA. Now, multinationals, for example, one of the ways they can take out this money, for example, is through what they call debt financing. You have a Ugandan entity, and you have, say, an entity in Netherlands. If I want to take away money from Uganda, the Netherlands entity, for example, can give a loan to a Ugandan entity with a huge interest rate. How is money going out? The Ugandan entity, because it has received this loan, it has to pay back the principal with interest. Now, the money is going out through that interest framework. Now, if that is the arrangement, if you do not have successful policies, that can be abused. And I have to say this, currently Uganda, to that extent, before it was a very big problem. And currently now what the government has done is to cap the extent of interest that you can claim. Because if I get a loan, it is money in the first place. If I'm paying back interest, it is an expense. It is a cost on me. It means basic understanding is that a cost of running a business should be subtracted from the money I make before they can tax me on my profit. So if I have a very big cost of running a business, I'll be in a loss position. And that was a problem previously. So what the government has done now is, it is saying you can only subtract 30% of the interest that you are paying back. The rest defer in the next financial period. And that is a very, very good policy now, because it means the multinationals now have to think before they can be able to get the loans, and also they have to plan on how they are able to repay back the interest. And that is a very, very good, successful policy. Yeah. The other policy that is in place, for example, is the Ministry of Finance has taken an initiative, and we've had a discussion on the tax havens and the double taxation treaties. Most of the double taxation treaties that we have, I think currently Uganda has negotiated, signed 9 double taxation treaties. Now, most of these double taxation treaties were problematic. One, in a way that they had the effect of taking away the taxing right from Uganda, or reducing the rates that Uganda would collect the taxes from. And I'll give you an example. We have a treaty with Netherlands, and if you analyze data from the Ministry of Finance, Uganda currently is doing very good business with the Netherlands. Or if you look at most multinationals, at least they have a BV somewhere, meaning it's a Netherlands entity. But why would that be attractive? It is because they can take advantage of the benefits. In the Treaty of Netherlands, if a Netherlands person controls 50% or more in a Ugandan company, the dividend that you pay, the dividend is after the company makes a profit, there's that money that remains. It means you have to give it to the shareholders. It's called a dividend. The dividend that you pay to that Netherlands person or company that owns 50% is taxed at 0%. You get? Now, you see a lot of money now being taken through repayment of a dividend, and Uganda is actually losing. So you cannot do economic development, you cannot do poverty eradication. Now, to that extent, in terms of a successful policy, the Ministry of Finance is thinking and saying, now, we are no longer benefiting from this. So they have recalled the Netherlands treaty, for example, the Mauritius treaty, and they are renegotiating them. At least I'm privy to this information. There's a renegotiation of these treaties.
And when you speak about the double taxation treaty as one of the loopholes, can you explain why such a treaty was made in the first place, and why was it made in the first place?
Okay, thank you. Maybe just to make it so basic for our dear viewers, for example.
For our dear viewers, myself
yes, and yourself. And yourself. Let me give you the context. The tax framework of a country is in such a way that a country has a right to tax every person who is within its geographical boundaries. That's the first place. Now, if you are a company, the country, for example, Uganda, has a right to tax you if you are incorporated in Uganda. Number 2, if you have your management or control exercised in Uganda. Number 3, if you choose not to incorporate, you also take your management and control outside, you have majority of operations in Uganda. Now, if that is the structure, it technically means that if I get a company that is from Mauritius, remember it is incorporated in Mauritius, it has to pay taxes in Mauritius. Now, if it comes and does business in Uganda, now those 3 tests, any one of them will be able to capture it. So you're going to find a situation that that company in Mauritius is taxed in Mauritius and also taxed in Uganda. Now, to avoid the possibility of double taxation, these double tax agreements and treaties needed to be negotiated. And I'll give you a scenario. In 1968, that's when we negotiated the first treaty with Zambia. The understanding then was, we have just got independence. We need to develop as Uganda. The British came and handed over everything to us. Now the government is thinking, how do we encourage investors? Now with the current law, the law that was then in place, it would tax the entity in Uganda and the other side. So in order to have to encourage them, let us go with the other country. Let's go to the country where that company is coming from. We sit at table and say, okay, you're going to come and bring some investment here. Is there a way we can have some bit of a win-win situation? Bring your investment, but much as my law is saying I should also tax you because maybe you're having your management or majority of the operations here, if you give me evidence that wherever you're coming from you pay the tax, I'll give you some credit. So in such a scenario, though, the multinational, Uganda becomes attractive to the multinational to come and bring, because now if I come, you will give me some tax. And it's a principle that if you are operating in Uganda, for example, if you find that you have incorporated in Uganda, you have management and country in Uganda, you have the majority, the principle of taxation is you are taxed on your worldwide income. Okay. So it means the Mauritius, when it is in Uganda, it has to be taxed. So the motivation then, to answer you shortly, was one, to encourage such foreign direct investment and also to discourage possibilities of double taxation treaty. I must state and emphasize, technically, a double taxation treaty is not concerned with the rate of taxation. It is concerned with the giving a benefit in terms of a relief. You get, so it does not set a rate at which you must tax, because that's a preserve of your local country.
All right, Andrew, I'm going to come back to you. But I want to move to you, Leah. When you look at the title of our conversation, it has gender justice to it, and I want us to bring the gender card in here. Clearly, revenue shortfalls make it difficult for a government to provide services. We can see that, and this obviously affects the entire citizenry. But how specifically does it affect women?
Okay, thank you, Josephine. I'll actually jump off from a submission that Honorable Vonji had made earlier. She talked about the Sustainable Development Goals. Actually, illicit financial flows really became an area of great concern because, you know, we have all these global goals that we're supposed to achieve by 2030, but you need to finance them.
Yeah.
So as part of the Financing for Development agenda, it was important that we are able to mobilize resources domestically. And that is when they were able to see that quite a number of resources that would have mobilized for our own development were actually going and developing nations that were mostly wealthy. So you have to think that every time there's a shrinkage in the budget, every time there's a shrinkage in revenue collection by URA, there's definitely something that has to suffer. The thing that won't suffer is military spending. The thing that won't necessarily suffer works and transport, because those are things that the president also really, really likes. And if you look at his priority issues, those are the ones that are touted. The things that will suffer are social services. So money that should be going to health, money that should be going to education, money that is supposed to be, you know, putting in place public transport. And those are things that women and girls benefit from the most, because at the end of the day, women do not have a lot of personal disposable income. So going to a public hospital, you find that it's mostly women that are benefiting from it. So anytime austerity measures come into play, those are the ones that are easy to cut, also without a lot of protest. I want to share certain stats that shocked me. Maybe they'll shock other people as well when I first came across them. The total global wealth in 2019, so when we look at all the revenue, all the money that is in the world, total to about 360 trillion US dollars, 360. When you look at Africa's share of that wealth, it's only $4.1 trillion out of 360, 4.1 trillion. So just look at that wealth gap. Now, another number that I would like to share is that when you look at the world's wealthiest people, if you pick out the 22 wealthiest men, you know, your Zuckerbergs and your Jeff Bezos and your Bill Gates, 22 of those men own as much wealth as all the adult women on this continent. So there are about 300 million adult women, and 22 people in the world own as much wealth as all of Josephine, you and I, and all the women that are here at NTV.
I don't know if we should even be in this picture.
Yes. And then the very last statistic that I will share. When you look at the world's 100 richest entities by revenue, 100 richest entities, 69 of those entities are corporations. So 100 of them, they're a mix of corporations and countries. 69 of those 100 are actually corporations, which means that we have corporations that are wealthier than states. If you look at the valuation, I think Apple is now the most profitable country the most profitable country. Why do I keep saying that? Company in the world. You're looking at your Amazon, you're looking at your Walmart. So that inequality, wealth inequality, is already a threat. It means that even when we are talking about these double taxation agreements, when you go to the negotiating table, we have no leg to stand on. We are so tiny.
Yeah.
And
I'm going to ask you to wrap it up because our time is quickly running out, and I want us to get into as much as we can, but yes.
All right, okay. So when you're looking at that wealth inequality, it means that the people that are actually deciding, first of all, it means that human rights and women's rights specifically are thrown to the wayside.
Yeah.
And because these companies have so much money to influence legislation, it means that they're the ones who are deciding for women what is best for them. And that is why you see a lot of private companies now, like pharmaceutical companies, talking about contraception and things of the like. And that is something that is definitely a threat. The other thing that we can look at as a result of illicit financial flows, the impact on women directly, is regressive tax policies. When you look at a good tax policy, it's supposed to be progressive. It basically means that the more you make, the more you should earn. The way that we have pay as you earn. But we have some tax policies that tax people the same no matter how much you make. And one example of that is value-added tax. So if I am buying soap of 10,000 shillings, I'm going to pay the same tax rate as Sudhir, even if he can buy so many other bars of soap. So a lot of these VAT are part of consumption taxes. They are levied on things that you buy, on cooking oil, on soap, as I've mentioned. And that is actually where women spend the majority of their money, which means that the burden of paying taxes or of resourcing the nation's purse actually falls on women. So in situations where there's a shortfall in resources, instead of taxing multinational corporations, then that burden is shifted to poor people. We saw an example of that with the mobile money tax, where they're saying, we need to increase domestic resource mobilization. Where are we going to get it? We can get it from mobile money. We can get it from OTT. And the impact of that is that in terms of financial inclusion, mobile money was this thing that had revolutionized access to finances and access to credit, and women had benefited the most because they don't have access to credit through banks. Another thing, just
the last one there.
Is it the very last? Okay, I'll put the 2 points together. The very last one, the very last two, if I can call them that. If a company, if a country is not getting as many resources as it should, it means that then obviously there is underinvestment in the economy, which means that there are not as many jobs. This has a direct impact on women because women are most likely to be unemployed, as shown by the ILO, and women are also most likely to take any job at any cost. We've had these conversations around domestic workers being paid 50,000 shillings, and people saying if she doesn't want it, there are a million more that will be able to accept that kind of payment. And then the very last thing is that if you do not have your own money, it means you have to borrow. So it means that you're relying on debt to basically run the economy. If you look at our budget this year, I think debt financing was the number 3 item on the budget after works and military spending. And that is ultimately really dangerous because it means that we don't even have money to pay for all these COVID tests that we're talking about because ultimately we need to pay back that debt.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
All right, so what we're going to do, because we have very limited time, Sydney, you're speaking next, but I'm going to ask you two questions in one, and you're going to respond to them as you make your closing remarks, which is going to be now. So I would like you to share reflections on how the regulatory framework in Uganda on business and commercial activities is equipped to handle issues related to IAFs, particularly money laundering, and is it working? And then as you close, I want you to speak to the kind of support that your organization, the Financial Intelligence Authority, needs in order to carry out its mandate effectively. And I will give you just a few minutes.
Okay, all right. A few minutes, that's about 10, right?
No, just a few, like 2.
Oh, okay, just to add on to what Leah is saying, since we're talking about gender, the third category I want to add to women and children is the older persons. They suffer as much as the other two categories.
I don't think we want to acknowledge that.
Yes, the older persons, especially for communities where the younger persons are more, those that are in the income earning bracket are like societies like ours, where the younger are more than the older persons. So it means at some point that ratio will change. So
Yeah.
that means the burden carried by those that will be supporting the older ones would increase, because now the state has less capacity to look after its older persons. So I thought I should just add that as a category. Now, in terms of the laws, like I said earlier, in terms of, again, it depends on the definition of illicit financial flows one wants to take. Because if you took the strict legal, these are proceeds from illegal actions, then we're well equipped, because we have all the legal and institutional framework in place. The challenge is the implementation. However, when you take the broader definition, then especially where 60% is contributed by illegal or by commercial practices that lead to the transfer and use of these funds illicitly, then I would say we're not well equipped. One of the issues has already been spoken to by Andrew, that is the double tax agreements. I think it's good that they're being renegotiated, but they're taking so painfully. The renegotiation process is so painfully slow. So one even contemplates the question that will the consequences of a unilateral termination be more palatable than this long negotiation process? So that is one area. Now, in two, the second arm of your question, what we'll need, of course, again, we have the laws in place, but the other players need to pull their weight as well.
Okay.
Because in terms of especially with the compliance, now the compliance levels in the banking communities are very high. But also we know that in terms of turnover of financial moves, for example, during, we know that, just to illustrate the point, in the last quarter we had the period between April and June, the turnover in the banking community was 241 trillion Uganda shillings. That was just the turnover. So of that, what is illicit and the rest, it's all jumbled in there. While the other sectors have contributed, like the next, in terms of size of contribution of the turnover, was the mobile money, and that was 2 trillion. The others were in billion of, that's the turnover, not the actual money in the system. So we need, because while with the banking we feel the compliance levels are high, the same cannot be said with other categories of reporting entities as far as the money laundering legislation is concerned. As far as the support from the government is concerned, of course, the main one is the budgetary support. That is always key, and many things go with it. And then from the law enforcement agencies, because we as an FIU or the FI, we do not have the mandate to prosecute. We provide intelligence. So the reports that we supply go to the law enforcement agencies, particularly the police and the Inspectorate of Government. So the support we need is the expeditious investigation and prosecution of those cases by the IGG. And then when it comes to the, finally, to the regulatory side, of course, the support from the other regulators, especially the ones that are key in the financial services sector, that is the Insurance Regulatory Authority for the insurance sector, the Capital Markets Authority for the security sector, and of course the Central Bank, Bank of Uganda for the banking and other financial services sector.
All right, thank you very much. Sydney Asubo is the Executive Director of Financial Intelligence Authority. And by me saying your title and everything means this was the last time you were speaking. Leah, I will come to you to make your closing remarks. And my question to you as you close, what are the key demands to government to stop the loss of resources?
Okay. So the very first
and
thing
briefly, yes,
would be for governments and regional formations to support the establishment of an inclusive intergovernmental UN global taxation body. So Andrew had spoken earlier about how great the OECD is, which is really composed of these rich countries that make all these tax laws, and many times they're actually unfair to us. And so we're saying that we should make this the job of the UN, so that then we can try to sit at the table as equals, although that is also not necessarily possible. I think it's also very important that when it comes to budgeting processes, a gender lens is used to ensure that there is equitable distribution of resources that, that tackle the unique needs of women and girls very specifically, and that investment in those spaces is maximized. I'll finish off by saying that this topic is incredibly important, and to emphasize the media's role in actually breaking stories like this, Josephine.
So
and
this is why I asked the other question and I didn't wait for an answer.
and this is because when you look at all the leaks that have happened, the Mauritius leaks, the Panama Papers, the FinCEN files, all this is important work that has actually been done by journalists. Of course, it is not easy work because you're fighting against those massive corporations that I talked about earlier, but it's important work. And to also say that we hope that, with this conversation started, we can become more aware so that we can start demanding for accountability. And the very, very last thing, Josephine, I will say, is to recommend a film for viewing. There's a film called The Laundromat on Netflix, if you have it, or you can go to your local film person. And it basically just dramatizes and provides really great education on how this financial system works. Thank you so much, Josephine.
Thank you very much, Leah. Leah Erenyu is a research, advocacy and movement building manager at Akinamama Africa, and it's been a pleasure having you join us on this panel. I will turn to Honorable Irene Ovonji-Odida for her closing remarks, and I will ask a question. Honorable Ovonji, what needs to change to stop the bleeding of resources from the global south and Africa in particular?
Thanks. Good question. So many things, and I think what my colleagues have said is part of it. And absolutely, the point that Sidi made earlier on about action that needs to happen at national level, and then combined with the point that Leah made about international level as well. So there needs to be action at a national level around, as he has said, around detection and enforcement, and strengthening the regulatory capacity. Ensuring that tax systems are actually progressive and require corporations, particularly large corporations, to pay their fair share. So to deal with the issue of corporate taxation itself, and also sufficient investment in the government agencies that need the resources and the technical capacity to deal with this, which will go beyond the tax authorities. They'll also include the trade authorities, they'll include the customs authorities, those involved in law enforcement and so on. So all of this. And for Africa, one of the gaps that has been raised is around the lack of connection or coordination, actually is the better word, between the administrative bodies or the enforcement bodies and the policymakers. So policymakers need to engage with those who are actually practically involved in, say, tax administration or enforcement around IFFs, so that when they take up positions in international spaces, those positions reflect the real situation on the ground and the priorities. One space where that gap has been identified is in the OECD BEPS process. And I share Leah's view, that the OECD BEPS process is not really the best space for Africa or for developing countries to participate, because of the way in which the space itself is owned and controlled by one region, by OECD countries. So shifting focus to a UN space is a constant call that has been made by developing countries, because within the UN, you have all countries are on an equal basis. All countries participate in rulemaking. The process through which rules are made is clear. All of these are challenges with the OECD process. And we have representatives, within the UN who are able to advance and support negotiations of our countries and our regions. So absolutely ensuring that the UN receives it once again has a central role, well, it actually never had, but that it has a central role in tax making and in international norm setting on issues relating to illicit financial flows. That is one of the pushes that many developing countries are calling for, and which it's actually reflected as well in the position of the Mbeki process. What else needs to happen? That's already quite a lot, but what else needs to happen at a global level? The governance. This is the question of who gets to determine the rules around, say, allocation of taxing rights, the rules around public reporting and anti-corruption. Who gets to set the rules on the digital economy? Because that's an issue we haven't even talked about, how the capacity of countries to tax corporates is being unraveled even more by the digitalization of the economy. How do you tax Amazon, which is headquartered in the US, but its reach, because so many people are using it, is global? How even European countries are grappling and failing to ensure that the transactions of these digital companies in their jurisdictions are adequately taxed. They get a market beyond the place where they are headquartered. How do you tax that? Even the OECD BEPS process, BEPS 2, which is supposed to be focusing on taxation in the digital economy, is failing to reach a consensus around that and to ensure that taxing rights for different countries whose citizens are consumers are fair when they participate in digital markets and in digital transactions. So for all those reasons, international cooperation really within the multilateral system, within the UN, would be it's more appropriate, because there's a higher chance of having fair rules within that, evolving from negotiations within the UN space. And then for Africa and developing countries, we also need to have much more regional solutions. So we need to have bodies like the AU and others in other developing country regions mobilize their members. So the AU needs to support its members to coordinate them, so that when they are engaging in, whether it's in the OECD or in pushing for a UN-led process, they work together and they build their influence in the negotiating space by collective participation. There are some initiatives around that, but they are not sufficient. And recently, about 3 weeks ago, maybe there was a meeting organized by the AU with a body called the ATAF, the African Tax Administrators Forum. It's a network of revenue bodies, to discuss exactly this. How do we bring together, how does the AU help to coordinate its members, the African countries, so that they are collectively engaging in things around allocation of taxing rights. They are collectively engaging in pushing the BEPS process to be fairer and more inclusive. So that collectiveness is important. And finally, I would say the facti process. We need to take advantage of processes that happen, because some of these things happen outside our space. They may not be happening directly in Uganda or in Africa. So we take advantage. And currently, I would say the facti process is one of those. This UN panel that is working on looking at cooperation in tax matters and the global architecture around that, and looking at accountability and public reporting, and anti-corruption, and what needs to change in international systems, and also international dispute settlement. So that process we are supposed to conclude it by February and present a report. We have an interim report which has just come out. It came out on 24th of this month. You can go to the facti website and download the report and see ways in which you can engage. There has been a lot of engagement by international civil society with a few African NGOs within that, like the Tax Justice Network Africa and a few others like that.
All right.
And women. I would suggest women organizations, women's rights organizations engage on these processes, because the decisions that may come out of them, the recommendations that come out of them, need to reflect our context in Africa, in developing countries, in Uganda. That will only happen when our voices are in those processes.
Thank you very much, Honorable Ovonji. Our time is fast spent, so Andrew, I will just allow you a minute to say something in closing. I have so many questions for you, so I won't ask them. I'll just ask you to speak about something you think we've left out of this conversation that needs to be said before we close in just a minute.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank Akinamama for this conversation. It's very helpful, and also I cannot fail to speak about a problem called trade invoicing, where values of exports and imports are played around or falsified by the different traders. It appears to be a very common and serious problem through which money actually leaves the country. Of course, on the overall, as a person who interacts with the tax-paying community on a daily basis, as well as the tax authority, I don't want to paint a picture that the MNCs are contributing to this. The position I would take would be, we have a regulatory framework that is encouraging them to do this, and that's what we have to do. Of course, there are things that have been done, especially from the tax law perspective. You have the anti-treaty avoidance provisions, you have transfer pricing regulations in place, you have anti-tax avoidance schemes in place, but we need to do more and ensure that we are able to stop or to discourage such exploitation of the loopholes. So I want basically to conclude by thanking everyone and our dear viewers for this discussion. Probably we can continue on the hashtag and maybe some other time as well.
So I didn't ask you to close the show. But thank you so much for that, Andrew. I'll just hand over to the Executive Director of Akinamama Africa, Eunice Musime, who will actually close the show and summarize some of the things that we've been speaking about. We have just a couple of minutes. Eunice, if you could take it away.
Thank you, Josephine. This has really been an enriching conversation. And like Andrew has said, we should continue the conversation in other spaces. That's my major takeaway, that we need to deepen this conversation. We need other spaces where we can have conversations that can unpack such conversations on critical issues. I know for many listeners, it may have come off as very complicated. I was hoping that today it would be a simple conversation. But even me, Josephine, I'm seated right here and saying, oh, wow, there's still a lot to unpack and a lot to understand. So thank you so much. My key takeaways are that we need to debunk the dominant narratives that we've been told. Like Leah said, we often feel that corruption is the issue that we are dealing with in terms of what is curtailing our development. But as we've seen, and from the presentation by Honorable Irene Ovonji, is that actually the illicit financial flows are continuing to bleed our continent, and this is something that we need to plug. It's also important to debunk narratives like that tax havens are the smaller countries. We know that there are other countries, which I won't name, that they too are making this, facilitating and enabling this practice. Of course, we need to keep positive. We need to look at some of the best practices that are emerging, issues to do with the base erosion and profit sharing conversation that has been going on with the OECD countries. And like Irene has rightly said, this needs to be brought in a space that is more that is more enabling than where power lies with certain people that are setting the rules. Of course, we have to end on a note of saying we need to interrogate our own development framework that is anchored in capitalism, that enriches a certain category. And Andrew, I don't agree with you about MSNs. Maybe it's a chicken and egg issue. They also need to be fairer. They need to promote practices that not only benefit their interests. Like Claire has said, it's unacceptable that 22 men own the same amount of wealth as the rest of us women all together. So these, we can't just simply say we need simple regulation and laws to plug this, because this is an economic issue. It's historical. It's anchored in systems that have been oppressive for a long time, and that's the root cause that we need to address. Plugging in terms of the regulation, in terms of the laws, will only address the stem issues of what we are dealing with. So I'll end on a note that we all can play our part in ensuring that we create mechanisms, practices, and methodologies that will ensure we have resources for our own development. Thank you, viewers. Thank you for listening in. Thank you, NTV, for hosting this conversation.